My VP fired me on a Friday afternoon with a 2-week check and an expectation of silence. He did not know I was already composing a message to his biggest competitor before I reached the pavement. He did not know that by the following Monday I would be sitting at a desk 12 floors up in the building his clients trusted more than his. He did not know that within 30 days, half of everything he thought he owned would follow me through that door. He did not know any of this because he had spent 3 years watching me work without ever understanding what he was watching. That was his mistake. It was also, as it turned out, the most expensive mistake anyone in that industry made in a decade. My name is Zara Voss. I was 31 years old on the Friday that Dax Coulter handed me an envelope and called it a ending. He thought he was discarding a resource he had finished extracting from. What he was actually doing was removing the only thing standing between Meridian Solutions and the slow, public, mathematically precise collapse that followed. He did not plan for that. He did not plan for me. And this is the story of exactly what happened when he made that mistake on a Friday afternoon. I joined Meridian Solutions straight out of a business graduate program. Junior account manager. Small salary. Shared desk. A list of dormant client contacts nobody else wanted to chase. I worked those contacts for 8 months before I closed my first major deal. Then 3 more in the same quarter. Within 18 months, I had been promoted twice and was managing the firm's most profitable accounts across technology and financial services. I was not loud about my results. I did not send company-wide emails celebrating my numbers. I did not position myself aggressively for visibility. I simply worked. I built relationships with clients the way you build anything that lasts, slowly, carefully, with genuine attention to what they actually needed rather than what was easiest to sell them. Those clients trusted me. Not Meridian. Not the brand. Not the company name on my business card. Me. Dax understood this. He had always understood it. What he did with that understanding was the problem. For the better part of a year, he had been taking my client presentations into boardrooms without me, attaching his name to strategies I had written entirely alone, and describing my results to the board as the product of his leadership. I had noticed every single time. I had said nothing. That was my first mistake. And it was, as things turned out, also his. The morning of the firing began like every other Friday. I arrived at 7:45. I made coffee in the small kitchen on the 14th floor and stood at the window for a few minutes, looking out over the city the way I always did before the day got loud. Avellini Cross, my closest friend at the company and the head of our research division, passed me in the corridor at 8 and said I looked tired. I told her I had not slept well. That was true. I did not know yet that my restlessness had been a kind of instinct. By 8:30, I was at my desk working through a proposal for Crest Capital, our largest account, worth more to Meridian than the combined revenue of our next 4 biggest clients. By 10, I had 3 calls scheduled and a lunch meeting with a client I had been nurturing for 6 months. At 11:47, Dax's assistant appeared at my desk. She looked uncomfortable in the way people look when they have been asked to deliver news they did not choose to carry. She said Dax needed to see me at noon. I saved my work. I closed my laptop. I straightened my jacket and walked to his office, not knowing that I would not be coming back. I need to tell you about the handshake. Because without it, what Dax did on that Friday is merely unfair. With it, it becomes something else entirely. 6 months before the firing, Dax called me into his office for a one-on-one meeting. He closed the door. He sat across from me and told me I was the most valuable member of his team. He said the client division's growth over the past 2 years was a direct result of my work and that the board had noticed. He said a senior director position was being created and that I was the only serious candidate. He said this clearly, without qualification, looking directly at me. Then he stood up and extended his hand. I shook it. He smiled. He said he was glad we understood each other. I walked back to my desk and told no one, not even Avellini, because I had been taught that you do not celebrate something until it is in writing, and I was still enough of an optimist to believe the writing was coming. What I did not know, what Avellini would only tell me after I was already gone, was that Dax had begun interviewing Bryce Halford the following week. While my hand was still warm from that handshake, Dax was on the phone with a recruiter discussing my replacement. He shook my hand. He looked me in the eye. And then he went back to his office and continued the interview process he had already begun. That is not a business decision. That is not a performance issue. That is a man who looked another person in the eye and chose, deliberately, to lie with his whole body. What Dax actually said to me in that 4-minute meeting was delivered without ceremony. The company was moving in a different direction. My services were no longer required. He slid a manila envelope across the desk. Inside was a termination letter already signed, a non-disclosure agreement he expected me to sign on the spot, and a check for 2 weeks of severance pay. 2 weeks. For 3 years of building a client portfolio that had grown from 11 accounts to 67 under my direct management. For the handshake. For every presentation, he had walked into a boardroom with his name on the cover and my thinking on every page. I looked at the check. I looked at Dax. He was already checking his phone. He did not offer me a box for my things. He did not walk me to my desk. He pressed the intercom and asked his assistant to escort me from the building. I picked up the envelope. I did not sign the non-disclosure agreement. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked out of his office without saying a single word. People ask me sometimes what I was feeling in that moment. The honest answer is that the shock had already worn off by the time I reached the door. What replaced it was something colder and more useful. Clarity. I cleared my desk in 11 minutes. I know the exact time because I checked my phone when I sat down and again when I stood up with my bag on my shoulder. 11 minutes to pack 3 years into a tote bag. My notebook. A small plant Avellini had given me for my birthday. A framed photograph of my mother. The rest I left. I did not make a scene. I did not cry. I walked through the open plan office at a normal pace, nodded at 2 colleagues who looked up, and pressed the lift button without looking back at Dax's glass-walled office. In the lobby, the security guard named Marcus, who had greeted me every morning for 3 years, who knew my coffee order, who asked after my mother whenever I mentioned she had been unwell, looked at my bag and then at my face and understood immediately. He said he was sorry to see me go. I told him it was fine. He said he meant it. That small kindness undid me more than anything Dax had done. All 3 years of it, the work, the handshake, the 4-minute ending, had not broken through. But Marcus, who owed me nothing and offered everything he had to give, which was simply the acknowledgement that I was worth being sorry about, that reached somewhere that professional armor did not cover. I held myself together through the revolving doors and onto the pavement before I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. I did not go home immediately. I walked. For nearly 2 hours I walked through the city without direction, letting the noise of other people's ordinary Fridays move around me while I processed what had happened and what I was going to do about it. 3 years. 67 clients. A portfolio grown by 400% under my management. A promotion promised with a handshake and then quietly handed to a stranger. And a non-disclosure agreement sitting and signed in a manila envelope in my bag and signed because I had understood, in the 4 minutes inside that office, that the only reason Dax wanted my signature was because my silence had value. People do not pay for silence unless there is something worth hearing. I sat on a bench near the river as the sun began to drop, and I opened my contacts on my phone and scrolled until I found the name I was looking for. 7 Adiz. Head of Client Partnerships at Apex Group, Meridian's largest competitor. We had met at an industry conference 14 months earlier and stayed loosely in touch. She was sharp and direct and had a reputation for building things rather than simply managing them. I typed a message. Short, honest, 3 sentences. I said I was available. I pressed send. Then I sat and looked at the river and felt, for the first time since noon, something that was not anger or grief, but something more like the sensation of a weight being removed that I had been carrying so long I had forgotten it was there. 7 replied in under 3 minutes. She said she had been hoping I would reach out. She said she had followed my numbers from a distance and had wondered more than once whether I was happy where I was. She asked if I was free for coffee the following morning. I said yes. 7 Adiz was not what I had imagined. I expected someone corporate and polished, the kind of executive who speaks entirely in strategy language. She was not that. She was direct and laughed easily, and within 15 minutes had asked me 3 questions that told me she already knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted the relationships. She was honest about that. She said Apex had been trying to break into the financial technology sector for 2 years. She said she knew I had built Crest Capital from a cold contact into Meridian's anchor account. She said she was not going to waste either of our time pretending this was anything other than what it was. I told her I had conditions. She said she expected that. I said I wanted a senior director title, a base salary 30% above Meridian, a performance bonus tied directly to accounts I brought in, and the freedom to manage my client relationships without interference. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said she could have a contract ready by Sunday evening. I walked home through the early evening streets and slept like someone who had made a decision. I spent Saturday doing 2 things. In the morning, I called my mother. She listened to everything without interrupting: the handshake, the 4-minute meeting, Marcus, the river, 7. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that Dax Coulter had done me the greatest favor of my professional life without meaning to. She had always had a way of reframing things that steadied me. That sentence steadied me completely. In the afternoon, I went through my personal files, the ones I kept on my own devices, not on Meridian's systems. Every contact I had built independently. Every relationship that existed because of my effort, my follow-up, my genuine investment in what those clients needed over years of consistent attention. I had been careful to maintain my professional relationships through personal channels as well as company ones. Not because I planned to leave. Simply because that is how I worked. I believed that relationships belong to people, not to organizations. Dax had a different view. He believed everything generated inside Meridian's walls belonged to Meridian. He was about to discover that a relationship built on genuine trust does not transfer with a company contract. By Saturday evening, I had a clear picture of where I stood. By Sunday evening, I had a signed contract from Apex Group in my inbox. I read it twice. I signed it. I set my alarm for 6 the following morning. I walked into Apex Group on Monday morning carrying the same tote bag I had carried out of Meridian on Friday. The symmetry of that was not lost on me. 7 met me at reception personally and introduced me to the client partnerships team, 8 people who knew who I was and why I had been hired and received me with the particular energy of a group that has been waiting for reinforcement. My office was on the 12th floor. It had a window that looked out over a different part of the same city. I sat down. I opened my laptop. I connected to the Apex system. Then I picked up my phone and began making calls. I did not tell clients I had left Meridian. I did not say anything negative about the company or about Dax. I simply called the people I had built real relationships with, told them I had made a career move, and said I wanted them to hear it directly from me rather than through other channels. I told them I was at Apex now. I told them I was still available to them. I told them the work I had been doing could continue without interruption if they chose to move their accounts. Then I listened. What I heard from almost every single person I called that first day was some variation of the same sentence. We have been waiting for you to call. The first 3 days felt like momentum. The 4th day felt like a wall. On Thursday of my first week, I called Harlan Greer. Harlan was the CFO of a mid-market logistics firm I had managed for 2.5 years. He was methodical, cautious, and deeply loyal to process. I had built the relationship slowly and had considered it one of my most secure. When I called, he was warm but careful. He said he had heard about my move. He said he wished me well. And then he said something I had not anticipated. He said he was not ready to make any decisions about the account yet. He said Meridian had already been in contact. They had sent their new director to see him in person, Bryce Halford, who had apparently prepared thoroughly and made a competent impression. Harlan said he owed it to his board to give the transition a proper evaluation period before deciding anything. I said I understood completely and that I respected his process. I hung up and sat quietly at my desk. That call was the first moment I understood that this was not going to be a clean sweep. Harlan was not the only client who would want time. There would be others who stayed with Meridian out of inertia or caution or a genuine willingness to give Bryce a chance. The question was not whether I would win every account. The question was whether I could build something durable enough to survive the ones I did not. I picked up the phone and made the next call. The first client to formally transfer their account to Apex did so on Wednesday of that first week. It was a mid-sized fintech firm called Burrow Technologies whose founder, a woman named Petra Olin, had been my client for 2 years. Petra had dealt exclusively with me for the entire duration of that relationship. She had never once met Dax. She had never had a meaningful conversation with anyone else at Meridian. When I called her on Monday, she had already heard I had left News Travels Fast and Tight Industries, and she had been waiting to hear from me before deciding what to do. She transferred Burrow Technologies to Apex on Wednesday morning. She sent me a message that said simply, "Wherever you go, I go." That message meant more to me than the contract value, which was significant. By Thursday, 2 more accounts had initiated transfer conversations. By Friday, 1 week after Dax had handed me a 2-week check and expected silence, I had brought 3 confirmed accounts to Apex and had active conversations with 11 more. 7 called me into her office on Friday afternoon. She looked at the numbers on her screen. She looked at me. She said she had known I was good. She said she had not fully understood the depth of what I had built at Meridian until she watched it walk through her door. I thought about Harlan Greer and said nothing about him yet. Some accounts take longer. That does not make them lost. What Dax never understood about client relationships, what separated his approach from mine in every fundamental way, was the difference between a managed account and a genuine partnership. Dax managed accounts. He tracked numbers, attended quarterly reviews, kept clients satisfied at a surface level sufficient to maintain the contract. He was professional and presentable and completely replaceable. He confused presence with connection and activity with trust. I built partnerships. I knew the names of my clients' assistants. I remembered funding rounds and the names of problems that kept them up at night. I sent articles relevant to their specific challenges. I called when there was no agenda, simply to stay connected. I celebrated their wins and helped them think through their problems privately. This cannot be transferred in a handover document. When Meridian assigned Bryce Halford to my former accounts, he received the files, the contact lists, the account histories. What he did not receive was the actual relationship. That lived in the phone calls, the trust, the years of consistent and genuine attention. It lived in the fact that I had once stayed on a call until midnight helping a client prepare for a board presentation that had nothing to do with our contract. It lived in the handwritten note I sent Petra Olin when her company hit its 5-year anniversary. Bryce was a stranger to every single person on that list. Some of them gave him a polite conversation. Most of them called me. In my 4th week, Dax's legal team made their move. Avellini sent me a message on a Tuesday morning that contained 3 words, "Lawyers are coming." By Wednesday afternoon, Meridian's legal counsel had contacted 2 of the clients who had already transferred to Apex, suggesting there might be questions around the circumstances of the account moves. They implied, without stating directly, that the transfers might involve the use of confidential information and could be subject to legal challenge. Both clients called me the same day. I will not pretend the calls did not shake me. Legal action, even unfounded legal action, is expensive and distracting and reputationally damaging in ways that do not require a courtroom to cause harm. One of the clients, a careful, risk-averse man who ran a compliance-heavy financial firm, said he might need to pause the transfer process pending clarity. I called Clara, my attorney, that evening. She reviewed everything I had done since leaving Meridian. She asked me to walk her through every contact I had used, every relationship I had leveraged, every piece of information I had brought with me. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They have nothing." I had not signed the non-disclosure agreement. I had used only relationships built through personal channels. I had taken no confidential data. Everything I had done was clean, documented, and defensible. She said to let her respond formally and to keep working. I kept working. Clara's formal response to Meridian's legal team landed on a Thursday. It was, by her description, comprehensive. It documented every contact I had used and its legitimate origin. It noted that I had declined to sign the non-disclosure agreement and was therefore bound by no such obligations. It outlined clearly that client relationships built on personal trust were not proprietary assets of any employer. It invited Meridian's counsel to identify any specific instance of confidential information misuse and indicated we would be happy to address it directly. Meridian's legal team did not respond with specific instances. They could not, because there were none. The threat dissolved the way threats built on nothing always eventually dissolve quietly, without announcement, leaving only the residue of the attempt. The compliance-heavy client who had paused his transfer process called me on Friday. He said his own legal team had reviewed the situation and found no concerns. He said he was ready to proceed. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat at my desk and allowed myself exactly the same thing I had allowed myself the morning after the firing. 10 minutes. 10 minutes to feel the relief of it, the vindication, the clarity, the knowledge that Dax had played his final card and found it empty. Then I picked up my phone and made the next call. Because Harlan Greer had called that morning. He said he had seen enough. He was ready to move his account. Crest Capital was the account that changed everything. Crest was Meridian's anchor client, the account that underpinned their revenue projections, their growth forecasts, and their credibility with investors. Its annual contract value exceeded the combined value of their next 6 biggest accounts. I had built that relationship from a cold email 3 years earlier, spending 11 months developing it before it converted. I had managed every aspect of that partnership personally from the day it began. When I left Meridian, Dax had assigned Bryce to Crest immediately. Bryce called Crest's CEO, a quietly formidable man named Callum Reeve, and introduced himself. Callum took the call, was polite, and then called me directly afterward. He asked where I had gone. I told him. He asked if Apex could service an account of Crest's complexity. I told him we could. I told him how. I gave him specifics, names, infrastructure, a proposed transition plan that showed exactly how continuity would be maintained. I did not ask him to move. I simply showed him what moving would look like if he chose to. He said he would need time to evaluate internally. 3 weeks later, Callum Reeves signed Crest Capital over to Apex. I was in Seven's office when the confirmation arrived. She sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that Dax Coulter had made a very expensive mistake on a Friday afternoon. I told her I agreed. Dax found out about Crest Capital on a Tuesday. I know this because Avellini sent me a message that afternoon that said simply, he knows about Crest. He is not handling it well. I could imagine the scene without needing details. Dax had built his entire leadership narrative around the growth of the client division. He had presented those numbers to the board as evidence of his strategic vision. He had taken my results into boardrooms and described them as the product of his leadership. Now those results were walking out of his building one account at a time and following a woman he had fired with a 2-week check. The loss of Crest Capital was not just financial. It was a credibility catastrophe. Callum Reeve was known and respected across the industry. When Crest moved, people noticed. Other clients who had been watching made their decisions faster. Meridian's quarterly numbers began moving in the wrong direction. The board requested an emergency review. Dax told the board that the account losses were a temporary market anomaly. He did not mention my name. He did not mention that the accounts had not drifted. They had followed someone. There is a significant difference between clients who leave and clients who follow, and Dax understood that difference well enough to be afraid of saying it out loud in a boardroom. He was buying time. He did not have as much of it as he thought. The growth at Apex was beginning to strain the infrastructure. By my 8th week, we had confirmed transfers on 27 accounts. 3 new account managers had been hired in 10 days. The onboarding process was stretched. 2 clients had experienced delays in having their transition documentation processed. One of them, a founder I had known for 2 years and considered a secure relationship, called me personally to say he was concerned. He was not angry. He was careful. He said he had made the move based on trust in me specifically, and that trust was being tested by the operational reality of a team under pressure. He said he needed to see the same level of attention he had received at Meridian, not a diminished version of it while Apex found its footing. I took that call seriously. I went to Seven that evening. I told her exactly what had happened. I told her we were growing faster than we could currently service well, and that a poorly serviced transferred client was worse than no transferred client at all, because it would validate every concern Meridian's team was whispering across the industry. Seven listened without interrupting. Then she asked me what I needed. I gave her a specific list. 2 additional senior hires. A dedicated transition coordinator. A temporary reduction in new transfer intake until the current accounts were fully stabilized. She approved everything by the following morning. The founder called me 6 weeks later and said the concern had been addressed completely. He sent 3 referrals in the same month. The number crossed 50% in my 10th week. 51% of Meridian's client revenue by value had transferred to Apex or was in its final stages. 7 called a senior team meeting to discuss the next phase. The room felt different from the first meeting I had sat in, fuller, faster, operating with the energy of a team that had been tested and had not broken. Meanwhile, Dax was doing what people in positions of failing power tend to do. He was making noise. Had not yet accepted it. His legal team had found nothing usable. His board was losing confidence. His new director was managing a diminishing portfolio with diminishing enthusiasm. The industry had begun to form a view about what was happening, not through any announcement or statement of mine, but through the simple, observable fact that clients were moving and not coming back. I had said nothing publicly. I had not needed to. The numbers were speaking in a language everyone in that industry understood. Dax had the contracts. I had the relationships. He had chosen to keep the contracts. And now the contracts were worth less every week because the relationships were somewhere else, working with someone who had earned them rather than assumed them. Bryce Halford left Meridian in my 12th week. He had been hired to replace me and had instead spent 3 months watching the portfolio he was handed dissolve account by account. He sent me a LinkedIn message, equal parts apology and self-justification. He said he had not fully understood the situation he was walking into. He said he respected what I had built and was sorry for his part in how things had unfolded. I read the message twice. And then I did something that surprised even me. I called him. Not to accept the apology or to offer absolution, but because I genuinely believed he deserved more than a typed response to something he had clearly struggled to write. He answered on the second ring and sounded uncertain in the way people sound when they have sent a message they were not sure would be received. I told him I appreciated what he had written. I told him he had not been the architect of what Dax had done. He had been an opportunist in the wrong place at the wrong time and had paid a significant professional price for it. I told him the industry was smaller than it looked and that his reputation was still largely intact because the people who mattered understood the difference between a bad hire and a bad person. Then I told him that if he ever wanted an honest conversation about where to go next, he could call me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had not expected that. I told him I knew. I wished him well and meant every word of it. The board removed Dax from his VP role in my 14th week. He was not fired. He was restructured, moved sideways into an advisory capacity that had a title and a salary and no actual authority over anything that mattered. It was the corporate equivalent of what he had tried to do to me, with one significant difference. Nobody was offering him a contract at a competitor on Monday morning. A new interim VP was brought in, a steady and serious woman named Orrin Falk, who had a reputation for stabilization work at companies in difficulty. She called me 3 days after her appointment. She was direct and professional. She said she wanted to understand what had happened from someone who had been at the center of it. I told her I was happy to speak honestly, but that I had no interest in damaging Meridian further. She said she appreciated that. We spoke for 40 minutes. She asked good questions. She listened without interrupting. At the end, she thanked me and said that the single most important lesson she was taking from everything I had described was this: relationships are built by people, not by organizations. Any company that forgets that deserves exactly what Meridian received. I told her I agreed. I told her I hoped she was given the time and the resources to rebuild what had been broken. I meant that too. Meridian's remaining staff were not Dax. They did not deserve to carry the weight of his choices indefinitely. Dax called me once. It was a Saturday morning, 4 months after the firing. I was at my kitchen table with coffee when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I answered because I always answer unknown numbers. He identified himself. There was a pause. I waited. He said he wanted to talk about whether there was any path back to a professional relationship, whether there was anything Meridian could offer to slow or reverse the account movement. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before in 3 years of working in the same building. Something brittle underneath the professional surface. I let him finish. I did not interrupt. I gave him the same quality of listening I gave every client, full, unhurried, without the kind of impatience that would have made him defensive. Then I said, calmly and without hostility, that the accounts had moved because clients had chosen to move them and that their choices were not mine to reverse. I said I bore no ill will toward Meridian as a company and genuinely wished them a recovery. I said I was not interested in a professional relationship with him personally and that I hoped he understood why. He did not respond immediately. Then he said he understood. I said goodbye. I hung up. I sat for a moment with my coffee. I thought about the handshake. About the 4-minute meeting. About Marcus. Then I opened my laptop and got back to work. The sale was announced on a Tuesday, 14 months after I had walked out of Dax Coulter's office with a manila envelope and an unsigned non-disclosure agreement in my bag. Meridian Solutions was acquired by a larger consulting group that had been circling the company for months, attracted by the residual brand value and the client relationships that had stabilized somewhat under Orrin Falk, but never recovered to anything close to their former scale. The acquisition price was not published. Industry estimates placed it at approximately 30% of the valuation Meridian had carried before the account exodus began. 30 cents on the dollar. Dax Coulter's advisory role was not retained post-acquisition. The acquiring company had their own leadership and no use for a man whose primary contribution to the company's recent history was a decision that had cost it more than half its client revenue. He was given a settlement and departed quietly. Avellini, who by then had been at Apex for 6 months and had become one of Seven's most valued hires, sent me a screenshot of the acquisition announcement at 7 in the morning with a single word beneath it. Inevitable. I saved that screenshot. Not out of satisfaction exactly. More because it completed something. A story that had started with a 4-minute conversation and an envelope pushed across a desk had reached its conclusion in the only way it was ever going to. The truth, given enough time and enough room to move, always does. Apex Group closed its best financial year on record 2 months after the Meridian acquisition was announced. Our client portfolio had grown by 280% since my arrival. We had expanded the team from 22 to 41 people. We had won 2 industry awards for client relationship excellence. Avellini had built a research division that 3 competitors had already tried to poach people from, unsuccessfully. 7 promoted me to Chief Client Officer, a role that had not previously existed at Apex, with a seat at the leadership table and an equity stake in the company. The day that offer was formalized, I sat in her office and thought about the Friday afternoon I had stood on a pavement outside a different building with a tote bag and a decision to make. I thought about Marcus. About Petra Olin's message. About Harlan Greer's caution and the compliance client's pause and the founder who had called me about operational strain, all the moments that had not been clean victories, all the moments that had required something more than momentum. I thought about Bryce and the phone call I had not needed to make, but had made anyway. I thought about what it costs to build something real versus what it costs to take credit for something someone else built. One of those things compounds over time. The other one collapses. I had always known which was which. Dax had never understood the difference. People ask me sometimes what I would say to Dax Coulter if I had the chance. The question assumes I have something left to say. I do not carry anger toward him. Anger is expensive, and I have always been careful with what I spend. What I carry instead is a clear understanding of what his choices revealed, not about me, but about him. He saw my work and took it. He saw my relationships and claimed them. He shook my hand and looked me in the eye and continued the interview process for my replacement the following week. He saw my value and then decided, when something shinier appeared, that it was disposable. That is not a story about my inadequacy. It is a story about a man who never understood the difference between possessing something and earning it. You cannot possess a genuine relationship. You can only earn one. Every single client who followed me to Apex did so because of years of earned trust, not because of anything printed on a business card, listed in a contract, or promised in a handshake. Dax had the contracts. I had the relationships. He chose to keep the contracts. The rest is numbers. And the numbers are clear enough for anyone who wants to read them. My name is Zara Voss. I am Chief Client Officer at Apex Group. And somewhere across the city, a company sold for 30 cents on the dollar because a man made a very expensive mistake on a Friday afternoon and never once understood what the mistake actually was.